So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. So I appreciate the fact that you're here today. I thank you for making time in your day. I know you're busy people, every one of you, and the fact that you tuned in today means a lot to me. If you like what you hear, pass it on, and we're building an audience, and the people that I bring to this show are remarkable people. They've done things, and they're writers, they're accomplished people. So it's valuable that they be heard. So whatever you can do to increase the number of people listening, I appreciate that. And today is a special day for me. I recently, my daughter Emily, one of my four daughters, gave me a Christmas present this year. It was a book, and the book was called Ask. And the subtitle of the book was How to Relate to Anyone. Here's what it looks like for those who are looking at this on YouTube. And I'll do that again so you can actually see the cover of it. There it is. And she said, Dad, you need to have this book. I go, okay, I need to have this book. I accept that. And I picked up this book, and I have to say that I couldn't put it down. I kept on reading. I read the book in a day or two. And I found the book to be tremendously useful. We're going to talk about this book because today we have the author of the book, whose name is Daniel Solin, on the line today. So Daniel Solin, it's such a pleasure to have you on the Hamilton Review.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
And let me tell you a little bit about Daniel Solin. Daniel is a lawyer by trade. He did his political science degree at Johns Hopkins. Then he came out to California for only 1 year. Is that correct? To Berkeley?
Correct. Yes.
For law school. Why didn't you stay in Berkeley for the whole time?
So good question. I'm from a small town in Massachusetts. I had never been to California, and I was at Berkeley during a period of tremendous tumult. My undergraduate school, Johns Hopkins, was only 1,500 students. Berkeley at the time was about 20,000 with a lot of demonstrations. I just found it overwhelming, although I enjoyed my year there immensely. The professors and students were just wonderful, but I was more comfortable back on the East Coast.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, Berkeley has got a reputation here in California too. Let me tell you. So I'm not surprised by that. So you went 1 year of law school in Berkeley, and then you transferred back to University of Pennsylvania, where you got your degree, and then you went into practice for 35 years in law.
Correct.
Were you? I should continue my introduction, Daniel. So Daniel. He became an author sometime during this time. We'll find out in a second here. He's written a number of different books, probably the best known out there for what is called the Smartest series. These are investment books, economic books, and what he calls the smartest sales books you've ever read. Dan's books have been widely praised by New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He's really had many accolades here. He's been on many TV shows, including The Early Show, The O'Reilly Factor, MSNBC, the Fox Business, CNN, and Money show. Daniel, you've done your share of work out there, a lot of media work, and I'm really honored to have you on this show. So before I begin our kind of in-depth conversation about your book, Ask, I'd like to have my guests share a little bit about their background, a little bit of how they got into what they're doing, maybe how you started writing books. You've had kind of an interesting career. You've been in the poli-sci, I mean, the lawyer world for many years, and then you segue clearly into writing books. So tell us a little bit about your background.
So in the latter stages of my legal career, I was representing investors who had been harmed by misconduct of their brokers. And those are arbitration cases administered by an industry, basically trade association called FINRA. And while I was a pretty decent jury trial lawyer, I was losing a lot of these cases. I felt the tribunals weren't always entirely fair because they were industry tribunals at the time. And I was just thinking there must be a better way to protect investors to try to keep them from suffering harm in the first place. If they knew what I knew, they could avoid these problems. So I started writing books intended really to, I did two things. I became a financial advisor. And then I started writing books in which I was saying to investors, there's really a simple, easy way to invest intelligently, and you won't become a victim of anybody. You don't need to go to me or anybody else. You can just open an account at Vanguard or Schwab and buy index funds. I mean, that was my basic message. And
Yeah.
those books took off because I think I was one of the first to write short, pithy, understandable books that anybody could read and understand. And I wasn't trying to drive people to me. So they had a ring of authenticity to them. The New York Times did a half-page review on a Sunday edition, and the sales just really took off. So I was getting, as an advisor, I was getting a lot of inquiries from people, but yet I wasn't really closing any more than my colleagues who didn't have that advantage. And so in to the lead up to the book that you read and the previous one called The Smart Sales Book was just, I was just motivated to find out, am I just bad at sales? Or how does the brain really work? How does it process information? And that's what led me to do all of that. So the
Yeah.
first motivation was to help investors. The second motivation was really to help myself.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book that this was kind of you took quite a while to actually do the research and really to lay the background for this book, and obviously you're drawing off of many years of life experience as well. But it is pretty clear when reading the book that was a little bit of a self-evaluation of you personally.
It was a process of self-discovery, trying to be more conscious of how I came across and to be more aware of what people were thinking while I was talking.
Yeah,
While most of it did, or some of it certainly did call upon experience, I would say most of it, certainly the substantive parts, are all based on hundreds of studies in psychology and neuroscience, which are set forth in a fairly extensive bibliography.
yeah. And I mean, the name of the book is called Ask, and I'm going to quote. This is about midway through your book, and you actually say there's a reason this book is entitled Ask. Here's what you say. If you want to make a connection with anyone in any context, ask questions. If you want to fully engage others with 100% certainty, ask questions. If you want to be perceived as a better employee or as a better leader, ask questions. If you want to reap the benefits of being more empathetic, ask questions. If you want to deepen your relationships with everyone in your life, ask questions. And finally, if you want to be liked, ask questions. And you say that the importance of asking questions cannot be overstated. Hence the name, the title of your book, Ask. So
Yeah, there's kind of a theme there that
yeah,
you
there's a theme. There's a pretty
the
clear theme.
theme that came out. Yeah.
But I think that this book spoke to me because, and I said this in our pre-call, that as a doctor I spend a lot of time telling people. I say do this, do that. I'm giving a lot of advice, a lot of recommendations. But I had to really sit back and think about what you were writing here, saying, you know what, maybe I need to be a little more inquiring of friends and family, and certainly patients as well. But Dan, can you kind of tell us a little bit about the premise of Ask? And I certainly mentioned these different larger topics here, but kind of lay down the premise of what you were trying to convey in this book.
So, the reason I'm particularly excited to be interviewed by you is that you're a professional who people come to when they are genuinely seeking your advice. And financial advisors are the same, and people in other professions, lawyers, accountants. So I don't want to convey the impression that nobody is interested in our advice. Within our area of expertise, people are very interested in our advice. When we get outside of our area of expertise, when people ask for our advice, they very rarely are seeking our advice. They're seeking to be heard and understood, and often simply to be validated. So the premise of ask is it's based on a lot of neuroscience studies. When we're talking and dispensing advice, our brain is feeling very good. The prefrontal cortex of the brain has been flooded with some neurotransmitters, oxytocin and dopamine. We're feeling good about everything. But the person in front of us, they're not feeling so good.
Yeah.
The longer we go on, they're going to feel diminished and trivialized and ignored. But when we get them to talk, and especially when we get them to talk about themselves, we're transferring those good feelings in our brain to good feelings in their brain. So amazing things happen when people like you and I, Dr. Baum, when we flip the switch in our brain from conveying information to eliciting information.
Yeah.
And that's basically the premise of ask.
And I can and I think that this is something that you see. I mean, I think that people do enjoy being heard, and certainly in this world that we live in, which is a world which is becoming less authentic all the time, to actually have a real conversation, to really have a really heartfelt interaction with another person is becoming more rare. And I think that you see that. I certainly, I can tell you that that is a big issue, certainly within the teenagers of our culture, and they are living more and more on Zoom. They're living playing video games, things like this. So I do think that interaction, first of all, is a very powerful thing. But when you actually begin to inquire what what was in the hearts of other people, that does open them up in a beautiful way. I mean, I know this is based on research. Can you tell us a little bit about the research that you have done? I know some of it was done back there at Harvard. Tell us a bit about that research, because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, the Harvard study really changed everything for me. It was a study done by the psychology department of Harvard, and I'm
Yeah.
going to just summarize it very quickly. But basically, the psychology professors recruited, I think it's roughly 180 or so participants, and they asked them to bring a friend or relative with them. They ran them through a series of experiments. In one experiment, they said, we want you just to go into this cubicle alone and just talk into a smartphone and just talk about yourself while hooked up to a functional MRI, which you obviously know, but your listeners may not know, measures brain activity in real time. So you can see what part of the brain is reacting while people are engaged in certain activities. Another group was just asked to view clips of famous people expressing opinions. And then they stopped and they looked at the functional MRIs. And what the functional MRI showed was when people were just talking about themselves with nobody else in the room, the prefrontal cortex of their brain lit up in a way that was indistinguishable from when humans engage in the most pleasurable activities they can engage in, addictive drugs, sex, gambling, whatever. And they were stunned by this, that they didn't realize that we enjoyed so much talking about ourselves. So they conducted a follow-up experiment, and they said, we're going to have you do the same thing, talk into your smartphone. We're going to then do a transcript and give it to the friend or relative that you brought with you, still hooked up to the functional MRI. And what they found was the prefrontal cortex lit up even more. So that's even when we're talking and other people can hear us talking about ourselves. And if you think about it, and you think about social media is almost all talking about ourselves.
Yeah.
It's never exploring what's going on in other people's lives. It's always, I did this, then I did this. It's like massive oversharing. So I read all of that and I said, I wonder what would happen to my relationships if all I did was encourage other people to talk and mainly talk about themselves.
Well, this, and you have, and you've conveyed this now to obviously, hundreds, thousands and thousands of people. And it's interesting in reading this book and watching some of the videos that I saw of your work, some of the testimonials are amazing. The one individual, and by the way, one thing I want to comment to my listeners today. I am a pediatrician. We're talking about a book of Ask. How does this relate to where kids and culture collide? Well, listen, here's my thinking, and this is why I had Daniel on the show, is because we have kids, we have teenagers, and a lot of times we as parents, I know I'm certainly guilty of this, I make a lot of demands or requests or whatever, but so many times I have to say, I wish I would have read your book 15, 20 years ago. I didn't ask a lot of questions sometimes, and I feel bad about that. And I guess that one reason why I was driven to read your book, immediately and so voraciously, was because I was convicted. And to be honest with you, I felt a little bit of guilt there, and thinking, this, I wish that during when my kids were younger, did I ask enough questions of them? And I think the answer was no. And some of the testimonials, Dan, tell us about, that one particular one of that father who went to one of your seminars and then had a lunch with his son.
So let me just say I share your guilt. I also also have children, and I wish I knew this research before. I also found, as an introvert, being kind of socially awkward around other people and feeling stress, um, all of which was transformed when I meet people. I just show a genuine, authentic interest in them. It's just for me, it's changed everything. So in the one example that you're talking about, somebody was present at a talk that I was given, came up to me afterwards and said, I am completely estranged from my son. And the reason I'm estranged is I wanted him to become a financial advisor and to be in my practice. And he has always wanted to be a chef, and I cannot understand why he would want to do that. And excuse me, that has caused a complete breach in our relationship. Going to have lunch with him right after this talk. How can I use the principles you've just discussed to try to heal our relationship? And I said, just switch your brain from conveying judgment or virtually anything. Put your agenda completely aside, and let's just discuss some questions that you could ask him in a non-threatening way. Like, tell me the work you're doing as a chef, and why do you enjoy, what parts of that do you enjoy the most? And why does that call to you so much? Where do you get all your satisfaction from? And where do you see yourself? What's your goal as a chef? And just ask innocent questions, not trying to drive the conversation in any particular direction. And I said, the rule I have for you is this: no sentence can end in a period. Every sentence ends in a question mark, unless he asks you a question. And if he does, I want you to answer the question directly and then turn it around, doing what's now called the Solin pivot to a question. Like, did I answer your question, or do you want me to expand upon my answer? And he wrote me this touching email afterwards that said they hugged, they cried, they reconciled. I mean, it was transformational for him. I've heard stories like this. How sometimes you set out on one destination, but you have collateral effects of what you're talking about that you never anticipated. So when I wrote this, it was to help me convert more prospects into clients. And when I started teaching it, what happened was people would come to me and say, my family relationships are better. My relationship with my wife and my children are better. My relationship with my colleagues. I never stopped to show a genuine interest in anyone. I was so concerned with trying to be the smartest person in the room. And it's really been a wonderful experience for them, but particularly for me.
We're gonna talk a little bit about some of your recommendations in a second here, but right now Dan, we're gonna take a two-minute break, and we're gonna come back as I have a lot of questions for you about this. But friends, you're listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. We're having a conversation with author Dan Solin about his book Ask. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
The Hamilton Review podcast is brought to you by Hamilton Babies, 9 kid-friendly products designed for the little loves in your life. Find them at hamiltonbabies.com or amazon.com. Also consider Dr. Hamilton's recently published book, 7 Secrets of the Newborn. Available at Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, and Amazon.com.
So friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're continuing our conversation with Daniel Solin. He's a lawyer, but he's also an author, written a fascinating book called Ask. We're talking about that today. So Dan, one of the things that, kind of caught my eye and kind of one of these things that I've been thinking about a lot is what you wrote, and you said, try to be the most interested person in the room, not the most interesting. And just as a personal comment, I've always, tried to, I tend to, carry conversations. If there's a moment of silence, I will pick it up and do something and talk about something that I'm doing or thinking or whatever. And that being said, I have to say that, that quote, try to be the most interested person, not the most interesting person. It was a little bit of it was a little bit of a moment. I kind of had to stand back and think about that. I love that quote. And can you kind of share with us today a little bit about where that came from and your thoughts about that?
So first, just a comment about you, based on our short relationship. I mean, you're a physician and an extrovert. And you would have a lot of reason to believe that it's important for people to hear what you have to say. I mean, because that's kind of your life's experience, right? And you're a parent and a grandparent. So that's the way most of us feel. It is harder for extroverts to adopt ask because of that need that extroverts have to fill in the blanks, as you properly indicated that you do. Like silence is very uncomfortable for extroverts. Introverts like me, we're happy not to talk. We're really happy to listen.
By the way, you're doing a wonderful job today. So if you're an introvert, I love it. You're doing a great, wonderful,
Thank you.
Wonderful job.
Thank you. So for this idea of putting aside my agenda and just focusing on somebody else, I call it the battle of the agendas. If I'm going to get a high by talking, I can either talk or I can take my high and give it to you. So what motivates me to do that? It's like asking a drug addict to share the drugs, right? Not likely that's going to happen. So why am I motivated to do that? Well, I'm very motivated because I'd like to have a deeper relationship with you, with my loved ones, with others, or if I'm in a sales context, there's a lot of data indicating that when you empower other people to talk, they like you better. And they attribute all kinds of positive qualities to you because so few people show a genuine interest in us as people.
Yeah.
So that line I have, which I hope doesn't sound jingoistic, but I mean, it's very easy if you understand the rule. The rule is I don't have to be the most fascinating, charming, humorous, engaging person in a conversation. I don't have to appear to be the smartest person in the room. I just want to be the most interested, authentically interested person. And the only way I can be interested is by asking questions. Dr. Bob, tell me about you. How did you get to where you are? And then asking appropriate follow-up questions, but not doing what most people do, pretending to listen, asking questions, or waiting to say something that one-ups whatever you're saying. You just took a bicycle trip around Santa Monica. I just took one around the south of France. Instead of doing that, I just listen to you and I just appropriately follow up. It's magical what happens when you do that.
Yeah. I guess that point, and you mentioned this in your book, sincerity is got to be really core to what you're talking about here.
Ask is not a manipulative technique. Humans are remarkably sensitive to being manipulated. There are a lot of studies in my book that show how sensitive people are to being sold, to being persuaded, to being led to talk about something. To implement ask, you have to genuinely put aside your agenda and genuinely be interested in them. You have to show genuine curiosity.
I think that, and we talked about this before, but I think that, one other word that came to my mind, of course, is just humility, and that willingness to kind of step aside and let another individual in that communication kind of shine. You mentioned, I think, in your book that there have been times where people have a conversation, and one person really does all the talking, that because they're being asked, gently led along the kind of this pathway of talking about themselves, and the individual will walk away from that conversation saying, "Oh, Dan Solin was the most wonderful person in the world to talk to. He's so interesting and everything." And the reality is that you hardly said a word or two, because the other person. And I do think that there is something very, very profound about that. Is that when you do allow other people, and this is something I'm trying to actually employ within my own practice. I have to tell you, Dan. Obviously, I have work to do in terms of what I have to, the advice I have to give people, but I'm also trying to engage people in terms of just saying, "How are you doing? Tell me more about your week. How did your vacation go?" And not necessarily related to the health of their child at that moment, but just to allow them to say something while they're with me. And I think that's a profound concept.
Well, first, I can't tell you how impressed I am that you do that. I mean, I think it's wonderful that you do that. I have no doubt that it has a profound impact on patients, because so few doctors really do that, and sometimes for very good reason. You have time constraints. You're under a lot of pressure. So I think it's wonderful that you do that. It's just it's so counterintuitive for us to be genuinely interested in others. And the way I demonstrate this when I give talks, I say, raise your hand if you've ever had this experience. In any social or business context, you say something that you think was really interesting about an experience that you had. You climbed Mount Everest, you went on an exciting trip to the Arctic, or whatever it was. And at the end of that conversation, the other person looks you in the eye and says, "Dr. Bob, tell me more about that." Raise your hand if that's ever happened. And I've probably spoken to thousands of people, and maybe 5 people have raised their hand. And then I say, "Okay, it's wonderful that that's happened to you. Who did that?" They'll always say this: "My mother, my aunt, my best friend." And I'll say, "How do you feel about that person?" And they'll say, "I love them. I love them. They make me feel so special." And then I say, "So what would happen if you were that person? If all hands in this 200-person auditorium went up and they all said, 'Oh, that's Bill sitting in the front row. He always makes me feel that way.'" That's what transforms people's lives. Once that light bulb goes off and they decide, "I'm going to be that one person in the lives of everybody that I meet who shows a real interest in them." And the reason people write to me the way you just described after they meet me is because I do show that interest. Nobody in their life has shown that interest. And they do attribute to me all kinds of judgment and wisdom, none of which is valid, because I barely spoke. I just elicited information from them. It's really remarkable. It's been fascinating to me. It's been the most fun I've ever had.
Well, I have to say, friends, that when I got on the telephone with Dan a couple days ago in preparation for this podcast, he started asking me questions, and I go, "Hold on, you're making me feel very, very good here." But I'm the guy who's supposed to be asking the questions. But anyway, he promised he would ask me questions on the show. So I do have another question, but I do, you know what? Listen, it's a pleasure talking to you, because I do get a sense of sincerity that you're actually interested in me, which is I guess we're all humans. We all appreciate that. But I do have a question about this. The subtitle of my show is "Where Kids and Culture Collide." You have kids, and I know that there's definitely a spillover here from business to our interactions certainly with other colleagues and patients or whatever, but also with our children. And tell us a little bit about you're talking to an audience here of parents. how, what any thoughts or recommendations regarding how you engage this concept of ask with your kids?
So let me tell you a quick story. It's a true story, but I have to be careful because I don't want to identify the people. Um, we were visiting some friends and staying over with them for like 3 or 4 days in their home, and they had two young children. I'd say ages at the time 6 and 8. And my wife and I both follow the same protocol. Of with her, it came naturally. I had to actually learn it. And all we did for the weekend, whenever we interacted with the children, was just ask them questions. Who'd you play with today? How was school? How do you like your teacher? Why do you like her? Would do you who are you concerned about next year? Just did that, all of that. Had a wonderful weekend. And then we were about to leave and we were going to get in the rental car and go to the airport. The children got in the back seat and said they would not leave the car. They wanted us to drive to the airport and take them home. And it just, and their parents are wonderful people. So it just, they, for your audience, what I would be saying is, and I don't want to trivialize what parents go through with children, particularly like teenagers and very young children. I know how I had two under two. I know how challenging it is. Not the way you know, but I definitely know this is challenging. So what I'm offering is not a quick fix, but it's a step in the right direction. Switch your brain from lecturing, educating, conveying, to showing an interest in them and to asking questions. Think about what questions can I ask my troubled teenager? And there are some very interesting questions that elicit interesting responses, like, what could I say that you would find helpful? Or what could I do that you would find helpful? How can I change that you would find helpful? If you were me, what would you do if you loved your child and you wanted what's best for them? What suggestions do you have? I mean, questions like that speak up to the child, that actually ask. I had this experience, I don't think I put it in my book. I had this experience that when I went to Johns Hopkins, I'm from a little town in New England. When I went to Johns Hopkins, my roommate was from New York City, a very sophisticated family, and they came down and took me out to dinner. And during that dinner, they asked my opinion on a range of subjects. And I remember thinking, you are the first person to ever ask my opinion about anything. And I wonder how common that is. How uncommon is it for parents to show a genuine interest in the feelings of their children and to really be interested in their opinions? Because children, I mean, I feel humble actually talking to you about children, but as you know, children at fairly young age, they have real opinions. And
For sure.
so you can definitely use the principles of ask to start the journey of improving your relationship with your children.
Yeah, and I can see that, and you know, I'm going to. This has been I have to say, your book and these recommendations. There's kind of common sense, Dan, in some ways.
Yes.
It isn't. I'm kind of going. Why didn't I see this a little more clearly beforehand? But definitely, I do see a lot of the teenage years are fraught with conflict, and I remember, I know that because I remember being a teenager. Okay, and so that's where I got to begin that experience in my life. But also, I see plenty of teens and their parents interacting together. But I do think that the take-home lesson here is really, and this goes certainly for me, and I guess everybody out there, is we need to be a little more sincere and ask questions and draw people out. Is what we're doing. We're really kind of saying, tell me about your life. Tell me about what's going on. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Rather than demanding that they feel this way, or demanding that they do this or that or the other thing. So it's a powerful thing. Dan, you have a couple other questions that you like to recommend to people. Can you kind of share those with us before we finish off here?
Sure. So I have a couple of sayings that seem to resonate with people. One is you can be the smartest person in the room, or you can get the business in a business context. Very difficult to do both. Another is curiosity, which you have, by the way. It's like very obvious from even talking to you on the phone that you're very curious. You're genuinely curious about things. That's a wonderful trait. So
Thank you.
the kind of response when somebody says something to start with, I'm curious about that. I mean, anything that shows a genuine curiosity, very positive. It's like kissing people on the cheek or something. It has such a positive impact on people. Another one is, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
Again, it's so rare. People can say almost anything, like the most incredible thing, and nobody will say, tell me more about that, like, because they're not interested. They want to tell you more about something. And then finally, and this is the overriding theme in the book, when you're talking, you're losing. You know, it's fascinating to me that as I'm talking now at about 100 to 125 words a minute, your brain is processing what I'm saying at about 500 words a minute. 80% of your brain is free to be distracted. On the other hand, the brain processes information serially. It isn't a supercomputer in the respect that it can deal with many different issues at the same time. So to test that, next time you're talking, try to come up with an extraneous thought. It's really difficult because all the bandwidth of your brain is being utilized to talk. That takes a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah.
So what's the consequence of that? If you want to engage somebody 100%, which is the goal of most people in a relationship. If you say, what do you want to achieve in this relationship? They'll say, oh, I want to engage the other person. But they want to engage the other person in what they're saying. So the other person will be interested in what they're saying. But if you want to really engage the other person, get them to start talking. Now their brain is 100% engaged. I always say this, I can engage anybody on any subject for as long as I want. People just look at me like I'm crazy. And I'll say, okay, stand up. Where are you from? How'd you meet your wife or husband? And then we can just go until I've proven my point. I said, okay, while we were having that dialogue, give me a list of all the other thoughts you had. And they can never come up with any. I said, okay, for the last 5 minutes, you were 100% engaged. And I just riffed with the subjects.
It's brilliant, Dan. And I can see why you have succeeded wildly in what you're doing. And I hope this book is getting out there. And I will tell you that, listen, everybody who's listening to this conversation today, I do recommend that you find this book. It is called Ask. It is published by Silver Cloud Publishing. I got it online, or my daughter did. She found it. By the way, my daughter's entire company had read the book, which is why how she found it. And apparently they're asking more questions, and they're certified financial planners. So that's what they want to definitely be, those people who are not only engaging people, but they're also making, they're bringing people to the table to sign.
Fascinating. No, fascinating.
Yeah.
I'll bet their conversion rates are going up because
Absolutely.
it's a very positive experience for people to deal with them.
This company is doing very well. So Dan, how can people find you?
I have a website relating to the book and a short course on the book. The website is askdansolin.com. That tells people more than they really want to know about me.
And Solin is spelled Solin, and he's pretty easily found out there on the web. And Dan, I just want to thank you again for taking your precious time to spend some time with us today on the Hamilton Review. So appreciate what you're doing. So
really, it was a wonderful experience to be with you. I can't thank you enough.
You're welcome. So friends, you've been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. I hope this has been a great conversation and interesting and useful for you. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.